As some of you know, I'm Fred Horner, former associate pastor here at First Presbyterian Church during the Shetler era. Let me ask you to raise your hands if you were here when Jerry was here. Okay, great. I'm going to ask you to be my corrective in what I say in order that we can get to the truth of these 10 years of ministry from your perspective as well. So at the conclusion of my remarks, would like to provide some time for Q&A and let you offer your perspectives or questions or ideas of what you remember happened during this time. As we celebrate the 200th anniversary of this church and its ministers, today we focus on the ninth pastor, Gerald David Shetler, who began his ministry October 1, 1998, and concluded December 31, 1998. Jerry said at the outset of his ministry of the church, "I think of myself as a pastor who tries to bring a balanced approach to ministry. I do not consider myself primarily as a preacher or a counselor or an educator or an administrator. My goal is a balanced ministry to all of these aspects." And now I'd like to offer a biblical framework for this homage to Jerry. And it comes from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. In his letter, Paul commends his readers for their faithfulness, addresses the conflicts that weaken the congregation, and encourages them to be and to become the body of Christ according to the good news that Paul preached to them. I want to paraphrase a passage from Paul's letter. "Now I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you be in agreement and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be knit together in the same mind and for the same purpose. For it has been made clear to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you, my brothers and sisters. And what I mean is that each of you says, 'I belong to Redhead,' or 'I belong to Mullen,' or 'I belong to Shetler,' or 'I belong to Christ.' Paul asked, has Christ been divided? Was Paul crucified for you?" And John Redhead, Joe Mullen, and Jerry Shetler would all reply, "No. We preach Christ crucified." And John Redhead's affirmation is written in stone in the tower ring, where he said, "Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel." When you go into the sanctuary, look for that tablet. I would like to use loosely a 3-point theme: change, conflict, and confirmation. These three are interwoven throughout Jerry's ministry. The overview of Jerry's ministry is accompanied by two bookends. The first bookend is this: John Redhead retired December 31, 1970, and Joe Mullen began January 1, 1971. One preacher followed another without skipping a beat. And now we fast forward 17 years. Joe Mullen retired on Easter Sunday, April 3, 1988, and Jerry began his ministry on October 9, 1988. Hardly time for the congregation to take a deep breath. Jerry was born in Flint, Michigan, and he grew up in Ann Arbor and Harrisonburg, Virginia. He attended and graduated from Bridgewater College in Bridgewater, Virginia, Union Theological Seminary, and received an honorary doctorate from Austin Seminary. Jerry's wife, Jane, has close ties to Greensboro. She was a graduate of Greensboro College with a degree in piano and music education. The Shetlers were the first couple to be married in the chapel at Greensboro College, and Jane's uncle, L.B. Gallimore, was the contractor for that chapel. In 1988, the Shetlers had and have 3 children. The older son, David, is a geologist with the Sun Company in Dallas. Suzanne is with an electronic data systems. And Todd, who was a rising high school senior, 17, was captain and end of his football team. He was such an outstanding player that he was sought by 20 colleges for his football acumen. Jane, understandably, stayed with Todd in Dallas until Todd could graduate from high school, which meant that Jerry was here from October until late spring of 1988. Now let me parenthetically set aside and make this comment. I believe part of the situation in which Jerry found himself as he began his ministry was that because there was no interim between Joe Mullins retiring and Jerry's coming, the congregation did not have opportunity to grieve. It did not have the time to process the transition from someone who had been here for 17 years and was much loved for his preaching and his personality and his ministry. And so it is my personal opinion that the congregation acted out its grief. And as this unfolds, perhaps you can decide in your own mind how true this was. Jerry's situation was not only exacerbated by the grieving of the congregation, but also by the fact that his wife could not be with him in these opening months, if you will, without a spouse. And that can be hard on anybody. When Jerry came in 1988, he was 54. He is now 91. And Jerry said this in his opening remarks to the congregation in a letter. I think of myself as a pastor who tries to bring a balanced approach to ministry. I do not consider myself primarily as a preacher or a counselor or an educator or an administrator. My goal is a balanced ministry that accomplishes all of these. The local parish is the frontier in the Lord's great church. My entire ministry has been set apart for this important point of service. The churches I have been fortunate to serve have been very different, most demanding, and highly dynamic. They were very different in the way each could be a new and exciting expression of what God's covenant is to be. They were most demanding in that they stretched me in new directions and demanded of me the very best that I could be as a pastor. They were certainly dynamic in that each was filled with confident and creative folk who were committed to growth both spiritually and numerically. I believe that Greensboro's First Presbyterian Church is such a different, demanding, and dynamic congregation. And I'm excited for this opportunity to serve our Lord as your pastor in the years ahead. In coming to Greensboro, I will bring no pat or patent answers to the problems that plague today's churches. nor will I offer an easy or inexpensive panacea as we face the 21st century in 11 years. What I will do is this. I promise simply and humbly to do my best to serve our Lord and you as a faithful pastor and preacher, to the end that together we may be what God calls us to be, his reconciling presence in the world is there for us. Please pray for me as I undertake this ministry. In the days just before Jerry was ready to begin his ministry and preach, he decided that he would come to the church to check it out. And you know how many doors this church had. So he was going from door to door knocking, hoping that maybe somebody would be here in order to let him in. And finally, after knocking on numerous doors, he heard somebody coming, and the door cautiously opened. And there was J.C. Donaldson, the general superintendent of the Sunday school. And J.C. said to Jerry, who was dressed in a cowboy hat, cowboy boots, and blue jeans, and had driven a pickup truck to the church, "Who are you?" Jerry said, "I'm Jerry Shedler, your new minister." And J.C. said, "I don't know you. I've never seen you before. I'm not going to let you in." And so finally, Jerry called one of the members of his pastor nomination group, who came over and convinced JC that yes, Jerry ought to be let in. So that was his part, Jerry's introduction to the church. Jerry wasted no time in beginning to build staff. In the first few months, with session approval, he employed Joe Garrison, former minister of the Church of the Covenant, and Larry Avon, former pastor of the Jamestown Presbyterian Church, as part-time parish associates. In January 1989, I was an associate minister of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Charlotte. One cold January Sunday in 1989, I was standing at the door after the worship service when a man approached me and said, "I'm Jerry Shedler from Greensboro. Could we have lunch together?" Well, Ruth Ann and the children had already left for home. So I called Ruth Ann and said, "Somebody has invited me for lunch. I'm going to go." So Jerry and I had lunch that January Sunday, in which he explained to me that when he had been pastor of the Preston Hollow Presbyterian Church in Dallas, he had created a position called Senior Associate Pastor of Program Administration. Jerry said, "I love to preach and I love to be with people, but I do not like committee meetings." He said, "Well, that's really what I have delegated to my senior associate, is to be in charge of the organization and administration of the congregation, and he can attend all the meetings he wants to." Okay. Well, I had earned a Doctor of Ministry degree that had emphasized church administration. And so his appeal sounded appealing. And so for the next few months, he and I were in conversation. I would come to Greensboro on occasion and meet with Jerry in his home on Worship Place, which is off of Hilltop. No, Round Hill, thank you. Off of Round Hill. And at that time, worship place was not cut all the way through. So at the end of his block, there were woods. But anyway, the congregation voted to establish an associate minister nominating committee in February of that year. And in October of 1989, the committee called for a congregational meeting in order to call a senior associate of program administration. My name was put in nomination. And at that worship service and congregational meeting were my two daughters, who were at the time students at UNCG, and they are here today. Subsequently, in December of 1989, there was an installation service held in the sanctuary. And I should say that members of my APNC who are still around today are Doug Albright, Ginger Booker, and Hugh Williams. At this installation service, which I remember was rather cold and dreary, I was installed, and then it was suggested, if I remember correctly, you all can be my correction, is that there be a brief reception following the service right there in the sanctuary. So the members of the APNC and family and I just kind of lined up in the sanctuary for people to speak to us and greet us. And I should mention at this point that Russell Sherrill was one of the members of that search committee. And it was at that point where Kevin Horner met Nancy Sherrill.
Yes.
And Nancy at the time was living in Dublin. Kevin was living in Charleston, South Carolina. Both had come over for the installation service. And I won't say it's like Harry meets Sally, but it was definitely Kevin meets Nancy. Now I would like to get into a period of changes. Kick these off with to consider what you all endured. In 1990, there was proposed a new vision project concept. The original concept said that this church would build Habitat for Humanity houses in Greensboro, in the region, and possibly even internationally. That was his original idea. People who were instrumental in developing that concept were Alec Wren and Graham Lashley. And I can tell you that in this very room, Graham, Alex, and others sat down at a table to flesh out the new vision project concept. It was thought that this project, which would involve members of the congregation, should not just be limited to building Habitat houses, but that it also should be a joint ministry with a church. So they looked at me and said, "Who do you have in mind?" Well, I did a little searching. Long story short, I talked with the presbytery exec of Atlantic Presbytery, who's based in Charleston, South Carolina, and explained our idea. And he said, well, you may want to talk to the minister of the Hebron Zion Church. He said that church has recently merged from the Hebron Church to the Zion Church. Each had their own building. Each did not want to leave their building, and they weren't too happy with the marriage. So he said, you might want to see if they could use your help. So I called and talked to the minister, Alonzo Washington, explained the situation, and he said, I'd be happy to have you come. So our first mission to Hebron Zion Church was twofold: to conduct a vacation Bible school with the children of the congregation, and to build habitat houses. The habitat unit of Johns Island, the Sea Island Habitat, is the third oldest and one of the largest habitat units in the country. So we went down not knowing what we were going to do. But we were graciously received by members of the congregation, and we pitched in building habitat houses. And that relationship continued for 17 years. We fell in love with with members of that congregation, and they fell in love with us. I must say that initially, I think our concept was, what can we do for you? We've got all the resources. We've got money, we've got people, we've got contacts. What can we do? That relationship evolved to where that congregation said, what can we do for you? They grew in strength, in relationship, and partnership, to where they said, we are not dependent on you. We're glad you come. But we know who we are. And we are glad that you can be a part with us. But we are stronger now because of this mutual ministry. And for that, I'm ever grateful. How many of you have been a part of that New Vision project? Wonderful. Great. Thank you. There were other mission trips as well. So the church is beginning to spread out in its concept of mission and hands-on ministry. In Arizona, South Dakota, Appalachia, and other places. It was getting its feet wet in hands-on, boots on the ground ministry. Another change. The Presbyterian hymnal was introduced in the pews in the congregation. And there were some who said, we were thoroughly satisfied with the 1955 red hymnal. Why can't we keep that? In the meantime, the hymn book of 1970 was introduced, and some people said it's too heavy and it's too thin. And now you're going to introduce us to another hymn book. Yes, we were. Because it kept familiar hymns, but also introduced the congregation to new hymns. In order to provide new hymn books and new NRSV Bibles, congregation could donate a hymn book or a Bible in honor of or in memory of. And that's how they were placed in the pew racks. And they were there until about 2018, I believe, when Glory to God was introduced, which is now in the hymn book, as you know, edited by Mel Bringle, whose mother and father were members of this congregation, Emmett and Kay Bringle. This past week, Kay Bringle died at River Lane, and her service will be upcoming. But talk about two strong individuals who reared a strong individual, poet, hymn writer, strong Christian teacher at Brevard College, and a child of this church. We couldn't be prouder. Subsequently, in 1990, after the introduction of hymn book and Bibles, we had a change in the order of worship. The first Sunday of Advent in 1990, in which the sermon was not just prior to the benediction, but it was in the middle of the service, followed by affirmation and offering. Following the word, we would have a chance to respond through offering and then to sin. There were people who objected to this, who said it's always been the fact that the sermon was held just before we left so that we could go out with that inspired word. The order of worship we use today is essentially the one that was adopted in 1990. It has been tweaked along the way. But again, another change. Another change which caused some dust up is that the congregation approved in December of 1990 the purchase of the sale of a house across the street on Green Street known as the Christine Lee East property. This was a house that was in rather ill repair, but it is in the Fisher Park Historic District. So there was a question about what could be done. Much appraisal was done, much discussion was done, and it was decided that there's really no redemptive value in the property. But there were some who insisted the house has always been there, it needs to stay there. But ultimately, the house was torn down with the intended thought that perhaps it could either be a playground for the weekday preschool or for parking. Now keep parking in mind because it keeps raising its In 1991, the church celebrated its first Joe and Betty Mullen preaching and teaching forum. And in that forum, Ernest Campbell was the first preacher, teacher. And he preached a sermon called When Deep Calls to Deep. I don't remember the content of that sermon other than it was substantive and it was deep, but it really resonated with my faith. And it was based on the opening verses of Psalm 130. When deep calls, when out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. It was a wonderful way to inaugurate this series in honor of Joe and Betty. Just for your information, subsequently during Jerry's ministry with us, there were these Mullen Forum preachers: Fred Craddock, who was a noted preacher and author, teacher of seminary students, and a wonderful person. Al Wynn, former president of Lowell Seminary, Joanne Adams, pastor of Fourth Presbyterian Church, Chicago, and Walter Brueggemann, author, biblical professor at Columbia Theological Seminary. We had some stellar people as a part of these moment preaching and teaching cultures. And now, in 2025, Cabin Road, a child of this church, an inquirer approved by this session to discern if he was called by God to become a minister of the Word and Sacrament. He'll be next Sunday's Mullen preaching, teaching preacher. What an honor to have him come back during our 200th anniversary as a child of this church, a child of Carl and Betty Rowe, to speak to us. At 4 o'clock next Sunday afternoon, Cabin will meet with those who want to come to speak about his new book, which I have read and which I highly commend to you, and it's available in the Welcome Center. He is a brilliant young man. In 1992, the session of the congregation approved the unicameral system, dissolving the Board of Deacons and becoming a decision-making body of the session. It was during this time that the master plan began to be fleshed out. This had started as a master plan in 1987, and basically it sought to do 8 things. Let me just quickly tick these off for you. To create a safe and comfortable environment which allows appropriate degree of accessibility and connectivity, compliant with acceptable building, handicap, and fire codes, and provides adequate security. At one time, I was told there are 58 doors to this complex. I'm not sure exactly the number, but that's probably pretty close. And the thought was, at any one time, at least one of those doors is unlocked and could provide access to anybody who wanted to come in. So security, of course, was a concern. If you look at the steps leading up to the sanctuary, I'm sure in 1929, those were thought to be commendable, and that this church stood as a shining beacon to the community, but anyone who is handicapped would find them formidable and prohibited. There was concern, given the number of buildings that we have as part of this complex, about accessibility. How do you get from one building to another without getting lost? And so there was concern about putting in elevators, putting in connectors, so that people would know how to get around. There was also a need for a new multipurpose building that would incorporate dining and fellowship and be a multipurpose wedding receptions, whatever. Maybe even a basketball court. The concern became more apparent. How many of you have been around when the fellowship hall and kitchen were located beneath the sanctuary? Right? Thought was, what if, heaven forbid, that something happened in the kitchen that could cause some type of destruction to the fellowship hall adjacent, but of course, even more importantly, what is above that fellowship hall. We need a different space that is multi-purpose. We need more Christian education space. We need better utilized where and how people are taught. We need to develop a comprehensive parking plan. I hate to tell you, but we're still working. Step aside to say just a minute. There have been various approaches to this, as many of you know well, particularly across Green Street. The church owned property across Green Street. What would happen if those facilities were removed and we put in some type of parking there? As I remember, after much discussion and research, it was thought that it would cost $1,100 per slot for parking. So we decided that wasn't easy. Let me quickly move on because I'm aware of the time. Dale Walker Davidson, a member of this church, was recognized by this church for having been a church member, being a moderator of the session, a seminary graduate, and in 1992 was called as an associate pastor of the Church of the Cross here in Greensboro. So there was a member of this church who felt called to ministry and was celebrated by the session for discerning that call. And Lisa Harrington, daughter of Jack and Betsy, spent 10 weeks in the Cameroon under the auspices of the Presbyterian Church USA. And as an intern, she worked in the Presbyterian Mission Hospital there and gave children tennis lessons, among other things. So again, a child of this church called into that form of ministry. Jerry had placed in the bulletin where staff members were listed at the top all the members of the church ministers. He saw each one of us as ministers in this congregation and saw it in his ministry to flesh that out. Let me quickly read to you this report on stewardship in 1993 by Henry Harrison. I think it's important and substantive because I think in part it began to shift thinking in our minds about stewardship. Henry said, first and foremost, stewardship is a spiritual effort, not a tradition of an every member canvas. We will need to ask our members to pledge probably in September or early October, but we will not refer to a percentage increase or an overall goal for the church budget. What we get, we get. We will communicate that a church member is not giving to help our church meet its budget and should not feel obligated either to give out of duty or out of habit. Our members need to understand that their contributions are nothing less than a matter between that member and his personal commitment to Jesus Christ. We believe that if spiritual renewal is authentic, members' pledges will exceed the budget with some despair. Second, our church is not a voluntary association of believers. We are people individually called out to receive God's forgiveness and renewing grace. God's forgiveness of forgiveness and grace is giving back to the world. I'm aware of the time And after having done 10 years of research, I feel like we could spend all day, but we will not. Let me say, providentially, I had a call yesterday from Jane Shepherd. Several weeks ago, I had written Jerry and asked him what one or two highlights he would think about or recommend as I was preparing to present his era to you. Jane said that with all that's going on in their household, that my letter had gotten buried under a stack of papers, and that she apologized for not responding sooner. Currently, Jerry is under hospice care. Jane said he is being treated extremely well by his hospice team, and they are doing everything to make him comfortable, which they both deeply appreciate. Jane said that when she talked to Jerry about this, he said, I would mention two things. One is my pastoral care with the people. He said he felt in my ministry we moved from a preaching point to one to where the congregation is caring for one another. And certainly he was the chief person. Secondly, he said it was the Capitol Fund campaign. Now, I wish I had time to share with you more deeply in detail about that campaign. But for me, in 1995, it was one of the defining moments in the life of this congregation during the Shetler era. There were many pros and cons about the feasibility of such a campaign that embraced $7 million, $6 million for construction, $1 million for benevolence. And there was give and take about renovation and upfitting and new structure. And there was debate about which benevolences do we support, which was good, because after all, we're Presbyterian. That's what we did. Jerry said he's grateful that we were able to do what we had done for the facilities: connectivity, accessibility, expansion, better use of space. But he said, I particularly appreciate the space that was devoted to youth ministry. He said they needed the space. And they used that space well. This was on the third floor of the Shetler building, which basically was a youth center. It was their space. And I think they deeply appreciated the fact that they were being affirmed as members of the church in this, and were able to conduct their teaching and ministry there. To bring things to a close, in 1998, in August, Jerry surprised the session by announcing his retirement at the end of the year in 1998. He said, quoting Ecclesiastes, that there's a time to be planted and there's a time to be plucked up from planting. He said, I've tried my best during these 10 years with you to provide a balanced ministry. And he said, now I feel that as I approach 65, But the time for me has come to be plucked up from being planted here and to accept a position at Austin Theological Seminary in an administrative position. And so reluctantly, the session concurred with his request. And that relationship was dissolved at the end of 1998. Coincidentally, providentially, the person who chaired Jerry's PNC in 1988, Charles Norton Jr., also presented the motion to dissolve the relationship in 1988, and that the congregation elect Jerry Shetler as pastor emeritus, pending the approval of Salem Presbytery, which certainly it granted. At a farewell reception for Jerry in the administration building, which is of course known as the Shetler Building, a portrait of Jerry was unveiled, and which now hangs in the Virginia Gilmer Room, which shows Jerry standing beside the baptismal font, which symbolically was saying this is the way that Jerry had of introducing infants, youth, and adults into the life of this congregation. And at that time, the building was named in his honor. Darlene Young said at the time, in 1824, when this church was founded, God had seen it fit to provide the right person at the right time. And we believe that this has happened with Jerry Shetler. The congregation elected Harold Bynum to chair a transition team. Harold and his wife now reside in Davidson and the Pines. But Harold and his transition team were charged with securing an interim pastor. So the session and the congregation saw the wisdom of having an interim pastor to provide for a transition from one pastor to another. Harold, I think, would whisper in your ear that he politely twisted the arm of a fellow Davidson College fraternity brother by the name of Vernon Hubbard, who formerly was minister of the Spring Hill Presbyterian Church in Mobile, Alabama. Vernon came with fresh eyes, fresh ears, a strong preaching strength, good at administration, good at listening, good at delegating, good at stewardship. Quickly, there were three things that I remember about them. One was he strongly encouraged church members to wear name badges. Hope you're wearing yours. Again, members of the church were reluctant. We don't need name badges. We know who each other is, which is typical, in my opinion, of a First Presbyterian church where we know each other. We don't need name badges. But he prevailed, and to this day, name badges are given out. Secondly, he would conclude often worship services with a mantra that he would ask the worshipers to repeat. We are a warm and welcoming church. And yes, in time, the congregation began to believe we are. That continues to this day. Thank you. And thirdly, Vernon preached a sermon titled "The Canary in the Mine in the Coal Mine," in which he said, "The canary is often the first to realize that there is danger in the coal mine because of gas that is not seen or smelled, and therefore the miners need to take appropriate action in order to avoid disaster." As I remember, Vernon cited 7 points in that sermon of which he felt the congregation was not aware of, or if they were, chose to avoid. It was politely, in your face, here's the truth. Here it is. The congregation, believe it or not, embraced that. I wish I could quote 7. I can't, we'll have to look it up. Lastly, Vernon had one weakness. He loved cheeseburgers. While he was here, he ate more than his quota, which he readily admitted. And during a Christmas holiday in Mobile, Alabama, Vernon suffered a heart flare-up in which he could not continue as our intern. Our hearts sank. Harold Bynum and the transition team immediately geared up and found E. Anderson, retired minister from Montreat, Virginia. E. was completely different, but was very effective, in my opinion, in helping this congregation continue its transition from Jerry to a new pastor and to anticipate what God had in mind for this congregation in the years ahead. So, my suggestion is that during this 200th anniversary celebration, as we celebrate the ministers past and present, tune in next week for the next installment, which will be led by Neil Donovan and Sid Batts era staging.